Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Joseph Rosenstein is the author of two prayer books that have been adopted by over 100 congregations, one called Sidur et Ratzon and the other Machzor et Ratzon. I have to admit, I was captivated by his Machzor when I attended a Day 2 Rosh Hashanah service back in 2014 at Congregation Romamu in Manhattan. I found that it opened the liturgy for me in ways that I had never expected. Well, Joseph has a new book out, and it's the one we are talking about today. It's called Reflections on Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, Not Just What My Rebbe Taught Me. Joe is a founder and chair of both the National Chavurah Committee and its Summer Institute, and he's been a member of the Highland Park Minyan in New Jersey since he and his friends started it almost 50 years ago. Joe has taught courses on Judaism for many years, but his primary day job for almost half a century was as professor of mathematics at Rutgers University, my father's alma mater. He's a graduate of Columbia and Cornell, and Joe developed the New Jersey mathematics standards that were adopted by the State Board of Education in 1996 and again in 2002. Joe has published a mathematics textbook for high school students, and he's co-director of an annual summer program for mathematically talented high school students that he founded 30 years ago, and it actually starts next week. We're in June. Joe and his wife, Judy, have 5 daughters and 12 grandchildren. Welcome, Joe Rosenstein. So good to see you.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's just start with Pirkei Avot. Let's not assume that every viewer knows exactly what Pirkei Avot is, and how do you just encapsulate or describe what we're dealing with?
So Pirkei Avot is a very small portion of what's called the Mishnah, which was developed in the year 200 approximately. It has all sorts of rules and regulations about Shabbat and festivals, about marriage and divorce, about civil and criminal events. And one small part of it is Avot. And Avot talks about ethical principles. It talks about advice for scholars and would-be scholars. It talks about advice for judges and would-be judges, and also has aphorisms for the general public. So
some have called it kind of the self-help book of Judaism, which I know is reductive, but there are ethical principles, right? Some of the ones we think of as when we talk about Jewish values are found in Pirkei Avot.
Yes, in fact, someone pointed out to me the other day that we have sort of collectively as a people absorbed the principles in Pirkei Avot so that they're part of our everyday conversation and our everyday behavior.
And we're going to talk about what some of them are specifically, but just to translate the Hebrew, I know that it's complicated in terms of what you actually think it means, and you unpack that beautifully in the book. But just very literally, what does Pirkei Avot mean?
Well, it's usually translated as ethics of the fathers. It's not only ethics, and it's not, the rabbis who taught these principles were not really called the fathers because the fathers were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but it's really a book of general principles about how we should behave. And that's the main reason why people have admired it and have studied it for the past 2,000 years.
Yes, in some ways it's much more accessible than Torah or Talmud that you read or study. I found that this speaks to us, particularly in this moment where we're feeling there's a lack of ethics in so many areas of our institutional and our religious life. But before we just go to the book, which I'm going to hold up here, is amazing, but you know, it's an undertaking, this book, and we're going to kind of digest it a little bit in the short time we have. I just want to explain to viewers that you are not a rabbi, and that what is interesting to me about your story is that you're a math professor who took the deep dive into Jewish texts simply because you love them and wanted to understand them. Can you just give us a sense of in your journey, how you got to this point?
Well, as you point out, I'm not a rabbi. However, over my entire adult life, I've had what are called chevrutas, that is to say, study partners. And I've studied with people for 50, 60 years. And over that period of time, I've absorbed a lot of Judaism and I've learned a lot of Judaism. I've learned it in difficult times, and I've learned it in relatively quiet times. And so I've learned a great deal. And how did I happen to write this book? Well, I've taught a great deal as well, not just mathematics, as you pointed out, but I've also taught Jewish topics in many different contexts over the years. And I started a weekly study session on Pirkei Avot a few months, I think, before COVID came about. And once COVID came about, it became a virtual study session, which meant that people from distant places could join in. And that study session lasted for 2.5 years or so. And somewhere along the way, as I was taking notes, I said, hey, I may as well write a book about this. I don't remember that event exactly.
Right, but it's the obvious next step. But Joseph, I thought what was interesting when I was listening to you in a previous interview, you talked about the fact that, as you were writing this, you were actually aware of the fact that the pandemic was looming, that COVID was looming, and that it was possible you might not make it to the end of the book. So how did Pirkei Avot actually guide you to keep working, knowing that?
So that's a very interesting question, because, in fact, there's a statement by Rabbi Tarfon which says, "Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor." It's not your responsibility to finish the job, but you don't have the permission to stop altogether. So that was very clear direction for me that I should keep going, even though I was concerned about whether I would, in fact, finish the book for a variety of reasons, COVID being one main one. So I just kept going. And I often found that as I went along writing the book, as I was writing the book, I often found that things in the book were very helpful to me in my efforts.
Can you give another example? I think at one point you had an injury, and again, you sort of turned to Pirkei Avot as a guide.
Yes, absolutely. I was having trouble recovering from an injury, and I was feeling bad about it because it was not progressing the way I had hoped. And I just remembered, of course, that Ben Zoma says, "Ezahu Ashir Hasameach B'Chako." Who is wealthy? The person who is happy with what he has. That the perspective that one has makes a big difference. So I took that as a mantra, and I repeated over and over to myself, "Sameach B'Chako, Sameach B'Chako." Be happy with what you have, because I have many blessings in my life. The fact that this is not working out quite the way I wanted it to, well, that's not a blessing. But I have many blessings, and if I focus on them, then I'm in a better place.
No, I think that it's really challenging to see these not as kind of quaint aphorisms, but as real directives or challenges
Yes.
that can animate your life. Before we go to some of the examples concretely, you mentioned two of the sages. Can you explain who are the writers of Pirkei Avot? Who are the voices, if I'm wrong to say that they're actually authors?
So there are many voices in Pirkei Avot. There's about 70 people who are quoted. It was organized, it was finalized, let's say, by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who Rabbi Judah the Prince. He was head of the Sanhedrin, he was head of the community, he was the greatest scholar, he had all the virtues that one could possibly have, and he had the organizational skills to pull this big Mishnah together, although different parts of it were written earlier by Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir in the previous generations, but they have quotes there from about 70 different people over a course of 500 years. So
there are 6 sections, and within those sections, there are tractates. Can you explain?
Right. So there are 6 sections of the Mishnah. That corresponds to the tune that we sing on Pesach at the Seder. Who knows one? Well, one of those is who knows 6, and everybody responds 6 are the books of the Mishnah. Of course, they don't know the 6 books of the Mishnah, but everybody knows that there are 6. And those 6 books of the Mishnah is each one is divided into tractates, so that there are probably around 50 tractates altogether. I haven't checked recently. And one of those tractates is Avot, and all of the other tractates were discussed in subsequent generations in the Talmud, but Avot was not expanded in the Talmud as the others were, because the others dealt with halachic practice, and they wanted to get the details right of halachic practice. And unfortunately, from my perspective, they didn't spend as much time talking about ethical things in the Talmud. That was not day-to-day a day-to-day necessity. So, but the number of people who are quoted in Avot is about 70. Some as early as 300 before the Common Era, which is roughly when Alexander the Great conquered Persia, and the Jewish situation changed because they had much more freedom as a community under the Persian rule than under Greek rule, and from 300 before the Common Era to 200 of the Common Era. So it's a 500-year period. There are not too many quoted from the first 300 years. Most of those quoted are from the 200-year period from roughly 0 to the 200 of the Common Era. But there's a large number of people quoted, and one thing that's really very striking is how well these people understood human nature. You would think that they were 2,000 years ago. People were very different than they are now, and their understanding was limited. But no, people are pretty much the same, and their understanding was very wise. Now, there are some statements in Pirkei Avot which are not quite as wise as other statements, but by and large, they have a lot.
There's a lot of wisdom, and for better or worse, we have not improved necessarily humanity. Let's just go to some of the specifics. I want to make sure that, as daunting as the structure sounds, that viewers understand you managed to actually organize it for us, so it's not so overwhelming. But for some of the things that I think will resonate for people, and tell me if I'm quoting your translation as opposed to actually someone else's. The wealthy person is one who is happy with what he has. You had invoked that. The wise person is one who learns from everyone. That's another. And if you are afraid to question the text, you won't learn what it has to say. Can you just pick up on any of those that you want to talk about?
I can speak about any of them. So one thing I learned as a kid, I remember, the book I have is entitled More Than What My Rebbe, or Not Just What My Rebbe Taught Me. I remember sitting on the porch, on his tiny porch, on spring afternoons, studying together Pirkei Avot. And we went through one Mishnah after another, as is commonly done, and as is commonly treated in books. But the kinds of questions which I learned to ask, because it says in Pirkei Avot, someone who's embarrassed to ask questions doesn't learn. So I always ask questions. That's true of me in my Jewish world, but it was also true in my math world. I was always asking questions and trying to figure out the answer to things. So a simple example: there's a statement in Pirkei Avot by Shmuel HaKatan, which says, when your enemy falls, do not rejoice. And what's very striking is that that's actually a quote in the book of Proverbs. Why is he repeating it here? And who's rejoicing? In his time, the temple was just destroyed, and the city of Jerusalem, which was a beautiful city that by all accounts was completely destroyed.
Decimated.
Who's rejoicing? So I asked myself, why is he saying that? And I figured out an answer. It may not be right, but the answer I came up with was, well, 9 years after the temple was destroyed, an extraordinary event happened. Mount Vesuvius exploded and buried this Roman city of Pompeii, a city comparable to Jerusalem. And it may very well have been that people would say, aha, you destroyed our city, God destroyed yours. Now,
is there any echo there of, I remember the admonition to the Israelites after they crossed the Red Sea and the Egyptians drowned behind them, that they shouldn't celebrate? That
they shouldn't celebrate. Well, not that the Israelites shouldn't celebrate, but the angels shouldn't celebrate. The Israelites were allowed to celebrate, and that is in a way a contradiction to what Shmuel HaKatan says. But in any case, I feel that I found a good answer to the question of why he said that. I may be wrong, but asking the question, why did you say that? So I came up with an answer.
Let's take another, the wise one is one who learns from everyone.
Yes. So that's based on a verse where David says, I've learned, B'kol olam dai hiskalti, from all those who have taught me, I have learned. Now, we can't learn from everyone because everyone is too many people. But if our approach to life is to learn anything we can from whoever we encounter, then we are, according to Ben Zoma, a wise person. That if you cut yourself off from learning in certain directions, then you cut yourself off from being wise. Now, some of the rabbis, for example, refused to learn secular material on the grounds that they should be learning only in only Jewish material. But other rabbis at the time learned Greek and recognized the value of understanding Greek because that was the world in which they lived.
So, Joseph, at the back of the book, you very helpfully list basically all the ethical principles. You kind of do a digest, and I just want to go through some of them because when you said that this speaks to our contemporary life now, it really, I think there's nothing more striking than that list and just how resonant and relevant they are. So
let me just make one quick point first.
Sure.
The ethical principles in Pirkei Avot are presented as general guidelines. They're not very specific, and often it's hard to determine exactly what they're talking about. What I tried to do was to convert them into imperative statements. This is what you should do. And so the ones that you're going to quote now are not literally translations from the Mishnah, but my attempt to operationalize what the Mishnah says.
And to your point, there's so much, there's almost like a whole category of humility that really came through so powerfully because I feel like there's such an absence of humility right now. But
the reason that's so important in Pirkei Avot is because there must have been an absence of humility then as well. I mean, why would they caution people not to be too proud? Well, obviously there were a lot of proud people around there. And so they had to make that statement over and over again.
So one of the principles, as you kind of digest it in your language, is avoid self-promotion, for it often undermines your reputation rather than enhances it.
Yes.
That just seems, again, like, yes, I'm hearing the bell ring that many people would relate to. Do you want to say more about that?
No, it speaks for itself. I mean, that was a statement by Hillel. And he said it in Aramaic because that was his native tongue. And, and he must have experienced a lot of people in his lifetime. He lived a long time. He must have experienced a lot of people in his lifetime who were promoting themselves. And
speaking of Hillel, Joe, if not for myself, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Is that also located in Pirkei Avot?
Yes, that's also in Pirkei Avot. And that's an interesting one because it's not clear how one should interpret it. Nowadays, we interpret it as each person should be an advocate for himself. And sometimes it's interpreted as saying the Jewish people should be an advocate for themselves. But that's not the only interpretation. Maimonides had a very different interpretation of that.
What was it?
Maimonides felt that the goal of each person was to become an ethical person, and through understanding and knowledge, he or she could become more and more ethical. And he was saying, nobody can do it for you. Only you can make yourself an ethical person.
So if I'm not for myself, as if you don't actually work on your own kind of ethical makeup, no one's going to do it for you. No one's going to be a good person for you.
And other commentators said differently. They said it had to do with one's education. If you don't take responsibility for your own education, nobody's going to do it for you. And I know that from my being a math teacher, because I had many students who just simply didn't take responsibility for their education. They just sort of sailed through. They put in their seat time, and they often failed because they didn't take responsibility for their education. So all of those are interpretations.
Possible meanings of that, what we know so well, the Hillel statement. What about greet other people cheerfully? A smile goes a long way in Mishnah 115. That seems so, really?
Yeah, it is.
We should smile more?
Just smile more. It's very striking that they would say that in those times. I mean, obviously people were as reluctant to be friendly as then as they are now. So I try this sometime. I sit on my porch here right outside the door, which you can see there. I sit on my porch and people go by and I say hello or good evening.
And how does that go over?
Well, some people...
They don't think you're nutty?
Well, some people respond positively. Some just keep walking. And I'm sure some say, what is this all about? Right,
but you probably lifted many people's day. In Mishnah 2:5, it's focusing on Torah study, which I know is a whole category, the importance of Torah. Make time for Torah study. If you think that you don't have time for it now, you will not have time for it in the future. Why is Torah study such a tent pole?
Well, this is something which developed during this period of the Mishnah. Before that, we don't have the same kind of emphasis on study of Torah, but in Mishnaic times it became very important because
the destruction of the temple.
After the destruction of the temple, particularly because they were very concerned that Judaism would have nothing to hold on to, and so what they wanted to do was make sure that enough people knew the Torah so that if the Romans killed many Akivas, as they did, then somebody would still know it and still pass it on. So they were very concerned with the future of Judaism. So for them, Torah study was very important. And there's a great deal of debate about how much Torah study is important. Who should do Torah study?
Right.
So clearly they felt that there was a category of people who were going to be scholars, but they felt that every person should engage in some Torah study. And in fact, Maimonides speaks about this. He says that, you should, and it's in Pirkei Avot also, that it's sort of in each conversation, you should build in something which is spiritual.
So Joseph,
it's something which we don't do because we engage in all sorts of conversations about sports, about politics, about all sorts of other things. And none of it is spiritually uplifting. And it's sort of an interesting idea. How would we do that? How would we change our behavior so that we could speak Torah, learn Torah on a more regular basis, not just when we go to the synagogue and hear a sermon from the rabbi?
So unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I don't want to leave without mentioning the dedication in the book, which is extremely moving, actually hard to read. You dedicate the book to your close family members who were murdered in the Holocaust. Can you explain that list and the decision to dedicate it to them?
So the first book that I wrote was many years ago, 40 or so years ago. It was a math book. And I put the dedication in the math book. I assumed that the author can dedicate the book however he wants. But they wouldn't let me have that dedication in the math book because they were concerned about markets in some countries in Latin America that might object to it. So I regretted that very much. And so I felt that this was the book where I should put it. I did not put this in the Siddur or the Machzor because it didn't seem appropriate. But here it seemed appropriate. And so I put this in. Yes, so it was very important for me to do that.
And finally, I love that you wrote also, to those who accuse me of chutzpah in thinking that I have anything to say about Pirkei Avot that has not already been said by other, more learned commentators, I plead guilty. However, if you continue perusing this book, you may decide that my chutzpah has some merit. I just want to say that I think your chutzpah has a lot of merit. Tell
you.
people how they can, just very quickly, how they can get this book, because it's not on Amazon, right? It's on your website.
It's actually on Amazon, but you can get it more cheaply, I would say, at my website. My website is just joerosenstein.com.
joerosenstein.com, and the book is called
Yes.
Reflections on Pirkei Avot. I know there's a subtitle, but if they look for Reflections on Pirkei Avot, they're going to find it.
Yes.
All right.
They will find it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. It's good to be with you.
Likewise.
Thank you for joining us on In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. See you next time.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.